Hi there, everybody, and welcome to another installment of AP European History. We're going to focus now and move from Italy up to the Northern Renaissance. And we understand that we see the Italian Renaissance begin a lot earlier, maybe 1350s, 1340s. And we're going to slowly see these ideas of Renaissance, this shift to these new ways of thinking, or maybe new old ways of thinking, if you will, from areas here of Italy to all points north. Understand that most of the countries that we have in Europe do have a renaissance, but it moves in waves, if you will, much like the plague did, starting here in Italy and moving slowly north through long trade routes, uh, mostly trade routes, religious routes, those kinds of things. But every big area, whether it be Spain, Poland up here, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, Germany, which doesn't exist yet, but the German states, if you will, France, Britain, all have their own Renaissance. With Britain's, I would say, probably being last, not really starting until the 1500s. Okay, um, and we'll see their shift in terms of government, in terms of art, in terms of literature. We're probably going to focus more on art and literature in this session here. But just know that this movement does move from south to north. Also, notice on the map down here just how much more dense it is with these cities, that these big urban areas in Italy. Italy is much more urbanized at this point than we see in other parts of Europe. And each of these cities then will have the opportunity to be a center of Renaissance. They will have a person who, they'll have people who are patrons of the arts, development of schools, art, literature. All those things are happening in these different cities. But notice just how much more uh, condensed or compact this is in Italy versus in the whole rest of Europe. Now, the biggest shift we see in terms of the way of thinking in the two areas of Renaissance, the Italian versus the North, is the idea of Christian humanism. And so, one in this idea of textual analysis and looking at these old classic documents, okay, in Italy, we see them really focusing on the classics, okay, the Greek writers, the Roman writers. In the North, they tend to still keep focusing on the church, but they take these ideas of humanism, of individualism, of human thought, of the ability to improve and have the potential to do great things, and they add this to the already present church beliefs. And as I will talk about these old writings of the Greeks and Romans, these people will read these for fun, but not for serious, legit study. They're going to focus most of their work on the Bible, okay? But instead of reading the Latin text of the Bible, these Christian humanists will focus on the Hebrew and Greek text. They're going to go back to the original text and figure out, hey, what was really being said here as part of their textual analysis. They're going to say, the Bible started in Hebrew and Aramaic and to Greek and then to Latin. Let's take it back a step or two, and we'll see what the Bible really actually said. These ideas of education and power was really important for institutional change and moral improvement. So the idea of thinking, of being a person, of being a skeptic for that matter, and not believing what you're told, but having your own individual thought process does play a big role in terms of the Christian idea of humanism. It's just a little more rooted in the church than it will be in England. We're going to show you some examples here of these writers, these Christian humanists, you will, Northern humanists, you will, in a moment. One thing we will tie together with some stuff we'll start studying probably a week and a half or so is the idea of Reformation, in that some of these early Christian humanists, especially our first author we're going to look at, are in some ways the spark, you will, of the Reformation. We'll get to that shortly here, okay? So our first writer is Desiderius Erasmus, or Erasmus of Rotterdam. And he's by far probably the most famous of all these Christian humanists, okay? He starts off as a language expert. Very nice hat, too. Picture, okay? Painting, I should say. Um, in that he learned the Greek language. And so what he does, he looks at the New Testament translation. He never, ever reads the Latin translation. He focuses on the Greek translation, the Greek writing of the Bible, and goes kind of back to the original writings before the church end up changes into Latin. And really, it was interesting that he was one of the first ever professional writers. He made his living by writing, and and he was a devout Catholic. He was a uh, he never dropped his church belief, but he wanted to reform the church. What he basically looked at was, okay, here's this Latin Bible, his Latin writings of the church. Is this really what the church has always said? And he said no. He wrote this book called In Praise of Folly. It was all satire, okay? Think of it as being the John Oliver, Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert-esque type writing of the 1500s. And when he basically wrote this book about showing all the wrong and bad, terrible things that monks and priests and nuns and the church was doing, and kind of just basically criticize all the immoral things, all the hypocritic things that the church is doing, and basically inspires his later calls for reform within the Reformation. Him and Luther never really got along, but that's a whole other story. Okay, he also wrote another book called The Education of a Christian Prince, almost as a way of like counteracting the Prince, which said, here's the secular way of being a prince. He wrote, here's a Christian way of being a prince and keeping all the Christian morals present there. This guy, probably the most famous of his writers, okay? He does do has a huge impact on religion and on people and on how things change in Europe throughout this Renaissance period, okay? So he's a Dutch guy. He's mostly focusing in Denmark, and that the Low Countries, you will, of Denmark, Belgium, Luxembourg. He's kind of focused there and where he lived. We have Sir Thomas More. So he's going to be your English guy. He was kind of our political type person of this, and he really had this huge political standing. I mean, he worked with the Tudors in England, who we'll talk about. He was an advisor to Henry VIII, and he rose this high position of government, okay? But he wrote this book called Utopia, which essentially talked about the idea of civic humanism, the idea of taking humanism and applying it to government and the idea of religious ideals. And the book was kind of cool in that he said, hey, if we took everybody and put them on this island, he wrote about how we could have no fighting. This perfect civilization on this island, kind of this ideal setting, you will, where all people live in harmony. And what he basically said was the whole reason we have problems in this world is property. If we got rid of all property ownership, we would have no more problems, no more fighting, no more lying, stealing, cheating, all that kind of stuff. And he kind of starts with this, looking for the problem in terms of why things aren't the way they are. And so if we would follow his ideals of a perfect utopia, those problems would not exist anymore because we wouldn't have any property. We would always share everything. Think of it as an early inspiration for communism, maybe. He actually ends up getting beheaded for how he feels about Henry VIII, and we'll talk more about this later on. But the idea of utopia still, is around, and we have utopian societies that 300 years later pop up in the United States. So this idea of utopia, of a perfect society where, the idea of property ownership, those kind of things are being studied here by Sir Thomas More. You have Jacques Lefebvre de Tablay, who was a French humanist. And what's kind of cool, what he did, just kind of very, quick here, he was, again, very religious, very devout Catholic, but he would compare those church writings. So he would compare the current Bible with the early versions of the Bible and see what had changed over time. He actually gets condemned for heresy because he was challenging the church so much. Kind of dangerous to do. You have Cisneros, who reformed the clergy in Spain. So here, we didn't really see a lot of this stuff in Spain because Spain is still a very, very Catholic country. So this idea of Renaissance didn't catch on as much there. Okay, and he actually was a big part of the Catholic Church too. He was the Grand Inquisitor who was trying to get rid of heretics. Okay, but cool thing he made is he made this Bible, right? It's a polyglot Bible, and it's a way to compare the textual versions of it. So he took on the same page Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and compare the translations all on one page as you read it to see if anything gets lost in the translation, if you will. And so here you see this guy focusing on these early church writings. You have Rabelais, who was a great guy. He was one of the very few secular northern humanists. He didn't really focus too much on the Bible at all. But his idea was human nature and these Italian Renaissance ideas, what a person does. And as he writes his book, okay, called Gargantua and Pantagruel, and essentially it's this folk epic tale about these giants who go around and do terrible, cruel, evil, crude, and just terrible, terrible things, right? And the book itself was considered crude and obscene. In fact, it was banned in libraries and stuff up through the 1950s. Essentially attacking how bad education is and how the monastic and religious education doesn't do anything, and how you want to see a more secular education society so that more people are educated, will not be essentially uneducated, immoral people, by showing just how bad things are. I mean, this stuff was just obscene in terms of the language and the violence shown in his writing. Michel de Montaigne, so this is a fun guy. He's a French skeptic. And he's actually one of the first ever skeptics we have, and he'll kind of come back and inspire our later on Enlightenment people. But he developed and wrote what we consider to be the classic essay. The idea of making an argument, and you guys will do this a lot here, trust me, okay? Of making an argument and then supporting it with evidence. And your argument can question the status quo as long as you can, back it up. And basically the idea that, true knowledge is perfect understanding of everything might not be able to be obtained. He essentially says, if we are challenging things, we gotta be cautious. We can't just go start making crazy, crazy, obscene statements about everything. We have to be critical of things, but you can't be personal and judgmental and be tolerant of all the views that exist. But really kind of creates this first idea of being a skeptic and questioning what's the status quo and what's out there. Shakespeare. Obviously, hopefully you all heard Shakespeare and you've read Shakespeare. Notice the dates are getting later and later as we go, the further we get from Italy, right? And so obviously he's a very famous, I consider him a Renaissance writer in terms of his plays, his dramas, his comedies, his sonnets, all those ideas. But we're going to echo a lot of if you look at the ideas of the Renaissance, a lot of them are present within his plays. He focuses on the classics. He writes about things like Mark Antony and Cleopatra. He writes about Julius Caesar. Okay, he writes about Greeks. Okay, and you have plays set in the Greek world. So huge classics done. Individualism. He focuses on a lot of individual characters. Hamlet, Macbeth. Okay, you see the individual characters and how conflicted they are. Okay, and so you have those individual ideas, and you have humanism too about what makes a person, and this internal struggle between your actions and your beliefs and how they do. And so, you have a lot of question. You have pagan rituals, okay? You question the role of monarchs in life on earth in terms of the plays. And so his plays do echo a lot of these. Also, a lot of his plays set in Italy, okay, like Verona and those kind of cities. So definitely Renaissance influence here in terms of William Shakespeare. Miguel de Cervantes, and we'll show you a video in class here, guys, but Don Quixote, which a lot of you have seen in Spanish class, if you took Spanish, huge this way. It's satire, okay? And so he questions all the old ideas, of religious idealism, of the great, valiant, chivalrous knight, and these old ideas that makes them look dumb, saying, guess what? These ideas, they're old, they're last year's thing, last century's thing. Let's get rid of them, move on. And one thing, we're bring back another slide here, but guess what? The printing press plays a big role here. This is how these ideas get spread and get printed with movable type from Gutenberg. And a lot of these books written by Erasmus, by Rabelais, by Cervantes, whatever it is, are printed and sold widespread. and spread these ideas. Thanks, guys.